The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty station in Yuma, Arizona Territory, and Penelope Zimmerman pressed herself against the worn leather seat, her heart hammering so hard she feared it might break through her ribs. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, a rancher named Jacob Xavier, who had written 3 brief letters describing his property and his need for a wife. The letters had been polite but sparse, lacking any warmth or tenderness that might have eased her fears. Still, anything was better than remaining in Boston with her stepfather, whose gambling debts had grown so large that he had begun looking at Penelope as a commodity to sell to the highest bidder. At 22 years old, she had chosen this unknown cowboy over a lifetime of misery with whatever wealthy man her stepfather could find. The driver opened the door and offered his hand. Penelope took it with trembling fingers and stepped down onto the hard, packed earth. The August heat hit her like a physical force, so different from the humid summers back east. Her navy traveling dress felt impossibly heavy, and sweat already beaded along her hairline beneath her bonnet. "Miss Zimmerman." A deep voice rumbled from behind her. She turned and had to tilt her head back to look at the man who had spoken. Jacob Xavier stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad beneath his dusty work shirt. His face was weathered and tan, with sharp angles and a strong jaw shadowed by stubble. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch, not from attraction but from pure instinctive fear. They were a pale gray, cold as winter ice, and when they fixed on her, she felt like prey being sized up by a predator. "Yes," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded once, a short, sharp movement. "Jacob Xavier, I will get your trunk." Without waiting for a response, he moved past her to speak with the driver. Penelope watched as he lifted her heavy trunk as though it weighed nothing, muscles flexing beneath his shirt. Everything about him radiated power and control, and her mind filled with terrible possibilities of what such a man might do behind closed doors. She had heard stories, whispered tales among the other young women considering becoming mail-order brides. Some men wanted wives only to have someone to cook and clean. Others wanted something darker, someone they could control and dominate without consequence in these wild territories, where law was scarce and justice uncertain. "The wagon is here," Jacob said, already walking toward a sturdy buckboard hitched to 2 horses. Penelope followed on shaking legs, her hands clutched together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. He placed her trunk in the back with ease, then turned to help her up. When his large hand closed around her arm, she flinched visibly, pulling away. Jacob's expression did not change, but he lowered his hand immediately. "The step is high," he said simply, then walked around to climb up on the driver's side. Penelope managed to climb up on her own, though her skirts made it awkward. She settled as far from him as the bench would allow, her body rigid with tension. The ride out to his ranch took nearly an hour, and neither of them spoke a word. Jacob kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the reins, while Penelope stared at the harsh landscape around them, wondering what kind of mistake she had made. The ranch, when it came into view, was larger than she had expected. A solid house with a covered porch, a barn, several outbuildings and corrals containing horses. It spoke of a man who worked hard and had built something substantial. Under different circumstances, she might have felt relief. Jacob brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down. This time he did not offer to help her, simply retrieved her trunk and carried it up the porch steps. Penelope climbed down on her own and followed slowly, each step feeling like walking toward her own execution. Inside, the house was surprisingly clean and well maintained. The main room held a table and chairs, a stone fireplace, and simple but sturdy furniture. Jacob set her trunk down near a doorway that led to what she assumed was a bedroom. "That is your room," he said, gesturing to the doorway. "Mine is through there." He pointed to another door on the opposite side of the main room. "I will sleep there. You will not be disturbed." Penelope blinked, certain she had misheard. "But we are to be married. Tomorrow. The preacher comes through once a month. He will be here in the morning." Jacob moved to the kitchen area and picked up a bucket. "I need to tend the animals. There is bread and cheese if you are hungry. Coffee on the stove." He walked out before she could respond, leaving her standing alone in the quiet house. Penelope remained frozen for several long minutes, trying to process what had just happened. He had given her a separate room. He had promised she would not be disturbed. But surely that was only temporary, only until after the wedding. The thought made her stomach twist with dread. She forced herself to move, to explore the small house that was to be her new home. Her room was sparse but adequate, with a bed, a dresser, and a washstand. Someone, presumably Jacob, had attempted to make it welcoming with a handmade quilt on the bed and a small vase on the dresser, though it currently held no flowers. Penelope unpacked her few belongings mechanically, her mind racing. She heard Jacob return an hour later, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. She pressed herself against the far wall of her room, listening to him move about the main room. The smell of cooking meat drifted through the doorway. "Food is ready," he called out, his voice carefully neutral. She emerged slowly to find he had prepared a simple meal of fried steak, beans, and the bread he had mentioned earlier. 2 plates sat on the table across from each other. Jacob stood near the stove, not sitting, not approaching, waiting. Penelope sat down carefully, and only then did he take his own seat. They ate in silence, though she could barely force down more than a few bites. She could feel his eyes on her occasionally, those cold gray eyes that revealed nothing of what he might be thinking. "The ranch is 500 acres, Jacob said suddenly, making her jump. If he noticed her reaction, he did not acknowledge it. "Cattle and horses mostly. I have 2 men who help with the work. They live in the bunkhouse near the barn. You will see them around, but they know to keep their distance from the main house." Penelope nodded, not trusting her voice. "I wake at dawn. I will not expect you to wake at that hour, but if you do, there is always coffee. I take my midday meal in the fields usually. I return before sunset." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I expect a clean house and meals when possible. Beyond that, you are free to spend your time as you wish." "I understand," she whispered. Jacob stood and carried his empty plate to the wash basin. "I will be up early to prepare for the preacher." "You should rest. The journey was long." He retreated to his own room without another word, closing the door firmly behind him. Penelope sat at the table for a long time after, her untouched plate growing cold in front of her. Everything about this was wrong. The silence, the distance, the cold practicality of his words. It felt like an arrangement for hired help, not a marriage. But perhaps that was all he wanted, someone to keep his house while he worked his land. She tried to tell herself that would be acceptable, that she could live with such an arrangement. But she had seen the way men could be. The way her stepfather had smiled pleasantly in public while terrorizing her mother behind closed doors. The way nice words could hide cruel intentions. Jacob Xavier had not spoken any nice words at all, which somehow made it worse. At least her stepfather had pretended. That night, Penelope lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to every sound the house made. She heard Jacob move around in his own room for a short while, then silence. Deep, complete silence broken only by the distant call of a coyote somewhere in the darkness. She did not sleep until nearly dawn, and even then, It was fitful and filled with anxious dreams. Morning came too quickly. Penelope woke to sunlight streaming through the single window in her room and the smell of fresh coffee. She dressed quickly in her best dress, a pale blue cotton that had seen better days but was still respectable enough for a wedding. Her hands shook as she tried to pin her dark hair into some semblance of order. When she emerged, Jacob was standing on the porch in clean clothes, his dark hair still damp from washing. He wore dark trousers and a white shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. He looked at her briefly, his expression unreadable, then nodded toward a wagon approaching in the distance. "The preacher," he said simply. Reverend Thomas Harrison was a jovial man in his 50s, with a round belly and a quick smile that seemed out of place in this harsh landscape. He was accompanied by his wife, Martha, a kindly woman who immediately took Penelope's hands in hers. "Oh, you poor dear, you must be exhausted from your journey," Martha said warmly. "But how wonderful a wedding! We do love weddings, don't we, Thomas?" The ceremony was brief and perfunctory. They stood in the main room of the house, Jacob and Penelope side by side but not touching. Penelope's voice trembled as she spoke her vows, while Jacob's remained steady and emotionless. When Reverend Harrison pronounced them husband and wife and suggested Jacob might kiss his bride, Penelope's entire body went rigid with fear. Jacob must have noticed because he simply nodded to the Reverend and said, "Thank you for coming." Martha had brought a small cake, and she insisted they share it with coffee while she chatted about news from other settlements. Jacob spoke little, answering questions with short, direct responses. Penelope said even less, too nervous to do more than nod occasionally. After the preacher and his wife departed, the reality of Penelope's situation settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She was married now, legally bound to this large, silent man who watched her with those cold eyes. She stood in the middle of the main room, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting for whatever would come next. Jacob put on his hat and moved toward the door. "I have work to do. The animals need tending. Should I prepare something for the midday meal?" Penelope asked, desperate for some sense of normalcy, some task to focus on. "If you wish. I can make do with what is in the fields." Then he was gone, leaving her alone once again. Penelope stood there for several long minutes before forcing herself into action. She explored the kitchen more thoroughly, finding it better stocked than she had expected. Flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, salted meat, and even a few precious jars of preserves. She set about making bread, kneading the familiar rhythm of kneading dough to calm her frayed nerves. The days that followed developed into a strange, tense pattern. Jacob rose before dawn and left the house after making coffee. He returned in the evening, usually after Penelope had prepared a meal. They ate together in near silence, and then he retreated to his own room. He never touched her, never even came particularly close to her. He spoke only when necessary, brief practical statements about supplies needed or work being done on the ranch. Penelope kept the house spotlessly clean and prepared meals with the ingredients available. She had little else to do. There were no books in the house, no neighbors close enough to visit. She was utterly isolated with a man who barely acknowledged her existence beyond confirming she had completed her duties. 2 weeks passed in this manner. Penelope's fear had not diminished, but it had changed shape. Instead of dreading violence or forced intimacy, she lived in constant anticipation of when the other shoe would drop. Surely this could not continue. Surely at some point Jacob would reveal his true nature, would demand the rights he had as her husband, would show whatever darkness lurked behind those expressionless eyes. One evening, as they sat at dinner, Penelope's nerves finally broke. "Why did you send for a wife?" She blurted out, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Jacob looked up from his plate, his expression unchanged. For a long moment he simply studied her, and Penelope regretted speaking. Then he set down his fork carefully. "A ranch this size needs a woman's hand," he said. "I cannot maintain both the land and the house adequately. But you could have hired someone, a housekeeper." "Yes." He paused, seeming to consider whether to say more. "It seemed right to marry. I am 30 years old. A man should have a wife." The practical, emotionless response was somehow worse than if he had expressed some warped desire or cruel intention. Penelope felt tears prick her eyes and looked down at her plate to hide them. "Have I done something to displease you?" Jacob asked, and there was something in his tone she could not quite identify. Not concern exactly, but perhaps the shadow of it. "No," Penelope said quickly. Too quickly. "You are afraid of me." It was not a question. Penelope's head snapped up to find him watching her with those pale gray eyes, and for the first time she thought she saw something behind them. Not warmth, but awareness. Understanding, perhaps. "I do not know you," she said carefully. Jacob nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense to him. He stood and carried his plate to the wash basin, and Penelope thought the conversation was over. But he paused there, his back to her, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "My father was a hard man," he said quietly. "He believed in discipline, control. He ran his household the way he ran his cattle, with force and intimidation." Jacob's shoulders tensed. "My mother was afraid of him, every day of her life until she died when I was 15 years old. I swore I would never be the kind of man who made anyone feel that way." He turned to face her then, and his expression was still largely unreadable, but there was an intensity in his eyes that had not been there before. "I do not expect you to stop being afraid immediately. I understand fear is not logical or easily controlled. But I want you to know that you are safe here. I will not harm you. I will not force you to anything. You are my wife, and that means it is my responsibility to provide for you and protect you. Nothing more will be asked of you." Penelope stared at him, her throat tight with emotion she could not name. "Nothing more, not unless you wish it." Jacob's jaw tightened slightly. "I know this is not what you might have hoped for in a marriage. Perhaps in time we might become friends. Or perhaps we will simply remain two people sharing a house and dividing the labor. Either way, you will be safe and provided for. You have my word." He left then, retreating to his room as he did every night. Penelope sat at the table for a long time, her mind reeling. She wanted to believe him. The desperate, exhausted part of her that had been living in constant fear for weeks wanted so badly to accept his words and let go of the terrible anticipation. But words were easy. Her stepfather had made promises too. Her mother had believed them, and where had that led? Still, as Penelope lay in bed that night, she found herself thinking about the tension she had seen in Jacob's shoulders as he spoke about his father. The careful way he always kept his distance from her. The separate rooms. The fact that in 2 weeks of marriage, he had not once tried to assert the rights most men would consider their due. Maybe, just maybe, he meant what he said. The next morning, Penelope woke to find Jacob already gone as usual, but he had left something on the kitchen table. A small bouquet of wildflowers, their stems wrapped in a strip of cloth. There was no note, no explanation, just the flowers, bright yellow and purple against the worn wood of the table. Penelope picked them up with trembling hands and felt something crack in the armor of fear she had built around herself. It was such a small gesture, almost absurdly simple. But it was the first truly kind thing anyone had done for her in longer than she could remember. She found the vase from her bedroom and filled it with water, arranging the flowers carefully. When Jacob returned that evening, she had prepared a more elaborate meal than usual, using some of the precious preserves to make a dessert. "Thank you," she said quietly as they sat down to eat. "For the flowers." Jacob nodded, and if she was not mistaken, some of the tension seemed to ease from his posture. "There is a whole field of them about a mile east. I thought you might like to see it sometime, if you wish." "I would," Penelope said, and meant it. The weeks that followed brought a slow, gradual thaw. Jacob continued to keep his distance physically, but he began to talk more. He told her about the ranch, about the cattle and horses he raised. He explained the water rights disputes with neighboring ranchers and the challenges of the harsh Arizona climate. Penelope, in turn, began to share small pieces of her own story. Not the worst parts, not yet, but enough that Jacob began to understand why she had come west and why fear lived so close to the surface of everything she did. One evening in late September, a month after their wedding, Jacob came to the house earlier than usual. Penelope looked up from the mending she was working on, immediately alert to any change in routine. "There is a storm coming," Jacob said, moving to close the shutters on the windows. "A bad one from the look of the sky. We need to secure everything." Penelope set aside her mending and stood. "What can I do?" Jacob paused, as if surprised by the offer. "The chickens need to be brought into the coop and the door secured. Can you manage that while I see to the horses?" "Yes." They worked quickly, and Penelope found herself running back and forth from the small chicken coop, gathering the scattered hens as the wind began to pick up. She had just secured the last one when the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy. Within seconds, it became a deluge. Penelope ran for the house, her dress quickly soaked through. She burst through the door just as a massive crack of thunder shook the walls. She stood there dripping on the floor, breathing hard, and looked up to find Jacob coming in from the other direction, equally drenched. "Are the horses secure?" she asked. "Yes, all the animals are safe." Jacob pulled off his soaked hat and set it on a peg near the door. "You should change into dry clothes. You will catch a chill." Penelope nodded and hurried to her room, peeling off the wet dress with shaking hands. She could hear the storm raging outside, wind howling around the corners of the house and rain hammering against the roof. She changed into a simple house dress and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, then ventured back into the main room. Jacob had built up the fire in the fireplace and changed into dry clothes as well. He was preparing coffee, his movements efficient and practiced. When he saw her, he gestured to the chair closest to the fire. "Warm yourself. The temperature has dropped." Penelope settled into the chair gratefully, holding her hands out toward the flames. Jacob brought 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair, a respectful distance away but closer than he usually positioned himself. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm. Then Jacob spoke, his voice quiet enough that she had to lean forward slightly to hear him over the rain. "When I was a boy, maybe 8 years old, there was a storm like this. My mother was terrified of storms, thunder especially. She would hide in the root cellar and shake like a leaf." He stared into the fire. "My father thought it was weakness. He would not let her hide. He made her sit at the table during the worst of it while he drank his whiskey and mocked her fear." Penelope's chest tightened. "That is cruel." "Yes." Jacob's jaw clenched. "I sat with her, held her hand under the table where he could not see. It was all I could do. I was too small, too young to protect her properly." "You were a child," Penelope said softly. "It was not your responsibility." "Perhaps." Jacob took a long drink of his coffee, "but I remember feeling helpless. I remember hating that feeling. I swore when I grew up I would never make anyone feel the way he made her feel, afraid in their own home, unable to escape." Penelope studied his profile in the firelight, seeing him perhaps for the first time not as a potential threat, but as a man carrying his own scars, his own pain. "Is that why you stay so far away from me? Why you never—" She trailed off, but Jacob understood. "Yes. I see the fear in your eyes when I move too quickly or speak too sharply. I see the way you flinch when I am near. I will not add to that fear. I will not become my father." "You are not him," Penelope said, and surprised herself by meaning it. "You have been nothing but kind to me." Distant, perhaps, but kind. Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them in that moment. Not love, not yet, but understanding. A recognition of shared pain and the beginnings of trust. "Tell me about Boston," Jacob said. "About your life before you came here." So Penelope told him. She told him about her mother, who had been kind and gentle and had died when Penelope was 18, worn down by years of mistreatment. She told him about her stepfather, about the gambling debts and the dangerous men who came to their door, about the wealthy merchant twice her age that her stepfather had tried to sell her to as a wife, and how she had seen the way the man looked at her, like she was a possession to be acquired and used. "I saw the advertisement for mail-order brides," Penelope said, staring into her coffee cup. "I knew it was a risk, but it seemed like the only way out. I thought anything would be better than staying. But when I arrived and saw you, so big and strong and stern, I thought perhaps I had escaped one prison only to enter another." "But you do not think that now?" Jacob asked carefully. Penelope looked up at him, at this man who brought her wildflowers and gave her space and spoke to her with respect even when he had no legal or social obligation to do so. "No, I do not think that now." The storm raged through the night, and they stayed up talking long past when they normally would have retreated to their separate rooms. Jacob told her more about the ranch, about his plans to expand the herd and improve the irrigation. Penelope told him about her love of reading and how she missed having books, and Jacob promised to order some from the general store in town on his next trip. When they finally did go to their rooms, something had fundamentally shifted between them. The fear was not completely gone from Penelope's heart, but it had diminished, pushed back by something cautiously hopeful. October arrived with cooler temperatures and brilliant blue skies. Jacob had to make a trip to Yuma for supplies, and for the first time, he asked if Penelope wanted to accompany him. "It is several hours in the wagon," he warned, "and the town is rough, but there is a general store where you could pick out some things for yourself. Fabric, perhaps, or those books I mentioned." Penelope agreed immediately, eager to see something beyond the ranch. The journey into town gave them more time to talk, and she found herself relaxing in Jacob's presence in a way she had not thought possible a month ago. He pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the territory, about its history and the people who lived here. Yuma was indeed rough, a dusty frontier town on the banks of the Colorado River. But to Penelope, who had been isolated on the ranch for weeks, it was wonderfully exciting. Jacob helped her down from the wagon with a steady hand, and she noticed she did not flinch at his touch anymore. The general store was a revelation. Bolts of fabric, canned goods, tools, books, and sundries, all crammed into a space that smelled of leather and tobacco. The proprietor, a weathered man named Samuel, greeted Jacob warmly and looked at Penelope with frank curiosity. "So you are the bride we heard about," Samuel said with a gap-toothed grin. "Welcome to Yuma, Mrs. Xavier." The name still sounded strange to her ears, but Penelope smiled and thanked him. Jacob told her to pick out whatever she wanted while he handled his business, and she wandered the store in a daze of possibility. She selected 2 books, some fabric in a pretty green that would make a nice dress, thread, needles, and on impulse. Seeds for a vegetable garden. When Jacob saw her selections, he added to them without asking, including more fabric. a new shawl, and several other items. At the counter, he paid without comment, and Penelope felt a rush of gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said as they loaded the wagon. "You did not have to be so generous." Jacob shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the gratitude. "You are my wife. You should have what you need." On the way back to the ranch, Penelope found herself sitting closer to Jacob on the wagon bench. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. When a rough patch of road jostled the wagon and she swayed into him, she did not immediately pull away. That night, Penelope began reading one of her new books aloud after dinner. Jacob sat in his chair by the fire, ostensibly working on mending a piece of tack, but she could tell he was listening. It became a new part of their routine, this evening reading time, and the silence that had once filled the house was replaced with the sound of her voice, and occasionally Jacob's quiet comments or questions about the story. November brought the first truly cold weather and the need to prepare the ranch for winter. Jacob worked long hours reinforcing structures and ensuring they had adequate supplies laid in. Penelope helped where she could, preserving vegetables from the garden she had started and organizing the storage areas. One morning, she woke feeling unwell, a persistent nausea that made it difficult to eat breakfast. She tried to hide it, but Jacob noticed immediately when she rushed outside to be sick. "You are ill," he said, his face creased with concern when she returned, pale and shaking. "You should rest. I will ride to town for the doctor." "No," Penelope said quickly. "It is not that kind of illness, I think." Jacob looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "You think you might be with child, but we have not." He trailed off, color rising in his tanned cheeks. Penelope felt herself flush as well. "I know. That is why it cannot be. I am probably just unwell from something I ate." But the nausea continued for days, always worst in the morning, and Penelope became increasingly confused and distressed. It made no sense. Finally, she forced herself to think back carefully over the past months, and a horrifying possibility occurred to her. That last week in Boston, before she had fled west, her stepfather had hosted a party, one of his gambling nights. Penelope had woken the next morning with no memory of the evening after a certain point, feeling sore and wrong in a way she had not understood. She had pushed it from her mind, too desperate to escape to examine it closely. But now, the realization hit her like a physical blow. She ran to her room and was sick again, though this time it had nothing to do with morning sickness and everything to do with the horror of understanding what had likely been done to her. She did not come out for dinner. Jacob knocked on her door, his voice edged with worry. "Penelope, are you well?" "Should I fetch the doctor?" "I am fine," she managed, though her voice was thick with tears. "Please, I just need to be alone." There was a long pause then. "I will leave a plate for you. If you need anything at all, please tell me." Penelope heard him retreat, and she curled up on her bed and let herself cry. For what had been done to her, for the new life growing inside her that was the product of violation, for the fragile trust she had been building with Jacob and how this would destroy it. When she finally emerged the next morning, pale and red-eyed, Jacob was waiting. He stood when he saw her, his expression serious. "Sit down," he said gently. "Please." Penelope sat, unable to meet his eyes. Jacob poured her some weak tea and set it in front of her, then took his own seat. "You do not have to tell me anything you do not wish to," he said carefully. "But I can see you are suffering. If there is something I can do to help, I will do it." The kindness in his voice broke something open in Penelope's chest. "I am with child," she whispered, "but it is not yours. It cannot be yours." She waited for the anger, the accusations, the violence. Instead, there was only silence. When she finally dared to look up, Jacob's face was carefully controlled, but his eyes held something that looked almost like rage, though she instinctively knew it was not directed at her. "Were you with another man before you came here?" he asked, his voice very quiet. "No. I mean, yes, there was a man, but I did not consent. I did not even know until recently that anything had happened." The words spilled out in a rush. "My stepfather had a party. There were men there drinking. I do not remember most of that night, but I woke up feeling wrong. I did not understand then, but now." Jacob's hands clenched into fists on the table, the knuckles going white. "Someone violated you." "Yes." The word came out as barely a breath. "You know who?" "No, I do not remember." Everything is blurred. Jacob stood abruptly and walked to the window, his whole body radiating tension. Penelope watched him fearfully, waiting for him to tell her to leave, to demand an annulment, to reveal that his kindness had limits after all. "I am so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I did not know. I would have told you in my letters if I had known. I understand if you want me to leave." Jacob turned sharply. "Leave? Why would you leave?" "Because I am carrying another man's child. Because I came here under false pretenses. Because you deserve better than a wife who is soiled and broken and pregnant with a rapist's baby." Jacob crossed the room in 3 long strides, and Penelope flinched despite herself. But he stopped a few feet away, seeming to realize he was moving too quickly. He took a visible breath and lowered himself to one knee so he could look up at her instead of looming over her. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice intense but controlled. "What happened to you was not your fault. You are not soiled or broken. You are a survivor of a terrible crime." He paused, his gray eyes searching her face. "And you are my wife. That has not changed. That will not change, but the baby. The baby is innocent. A child is a child, regardless of how it was conceived." Jacob's jaw tightened. "I will not punish an innocent child or you for the actions of an evil man." Penelope stared at him in disbelief. "You would raise another man's child as your own." "I would raise your child. Yes." He said it with such simple conviction that Penelope felt her heart crack wide open. She began to sob, deep, wrenching cries that shook her whole body. Jacob hesitated for only a moment before moving closer, and this time when he reached for her, Penelope did not pull away. She let him gather her into his arms, let herself cry against his solid chest while he held her carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. "You are safe," he murmured into her hair. "I promise you are safe. Nothing and no one will hurt you here, not while I draw breath." They stayed like that for a long time, until Penelope's sobs subsided into hiccuping breaths. When she finally pulled back, Jacob released her immediately, giving her space but staying close. "What do we do now?" she asked, wiping at her tear-stained face. "Now we prepare," Jacob said practically. "You are with child. That means you need proper food, rest, and care. I will make sure you have all 3. Over the following weeks, Jacob was true to his word. He adjusted his work schedule to be closer to the house, checked on Penelope frequently, and ensured she had everything she needed. The morning sickness persisted through November, but Jacob took it in stride, often sitting with her in the early mornings, holding her hair back when necessary and bringing her weak tea and dry toast afterward. The physical proximity required by her condition gradually wore away the last of the walls between them. Penelope grew comfortable with Jacob's presence, even seeking it out when she felt unwell or anxious. Jacob, in turn, became more open with his own thoughts and feelings, sharing stories from his past and his hopes for the future. One December evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Jacob spoke about the coming baby with a thoughtfulness that made Penelope's heart ache. "We will need to add on to the house," he said, sketching plans on a piece of paper. "A proper nursery, and we should think about hiring a woman from town to help you when the time comes, someone with experience in birthing." "You have given this a lot of thought," Penelope said softly. "Of course." Jacob looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something warm. "This is my family now, you and the child. I take care of my family." "Jacob," Penelope said, her voice thick with emotion, "why are you being so kind to me? You did not have to accept this situation. You could have sent me back to Boston." Jacob set down his pencil and turned to face her fully. "Do you want the honest truth?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. "When you first arrived and I saw how afraid you were, it made me angry. Not at you, but at whatever had been done to you to make you that way. I saw my mother in you, that same fear in the eyes. And I made a choice then that I would rather live alone forever than become the kind of man who perpetuates that fear." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about that. You are not my mother and I am not my father. You are Penelope. You are kind and resilient and braver than you give yourself credit for. You read to me in the evenings and you laugh at my bad jokes, and you made curtains for the windows even though I never asked. You have made this house a home." Penelope felt tears welling up again. "I have feelings for you," she blurted out. "Real feelings. Not just gratitude or relief, but actual affection. Is that wrong, given everything?" "No." Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. "It is not wrong because I have feelings for you too. I think I have for weeks now." They stared at each other across the short distance that separated them. And slowly, carefully, Jacob reached out his hand. Penelope took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining naturally. The touch sent warmth flooding through her, not fear, just warmth and safety and the beginnings of something that felt remarkably like love. "May I kiss you?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Penelope's breath caught. A month ago, even a week ago, such a question would have terrified her. Now it filled her with nervous anticipation. "Yes." Jacob moved slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. He cupped her face gently with his free hand, his calloused thumb brushing her cheekbone, then lowered his lips to hers in the softest, most tender kiss Penelope had ever imagined. It was nothing like the rough, forceful kisses she had witnessed between her stepfather and his various women. This was gentle and questioning and full of restrained emotion. When they parted, Penelope was crying again, but this time from happiness. "I love you," she said, the words escaping before she could think better of them. Jacob's face transformed, a genuine smile breaking across his usually serious features. "I love you too. I think I have since you brought in those chickens during the storm, so determined and brave even though you were frightened." That night marked a turning point in their marriage. They began to truly be husband and wife in every sense, though Jacob remained always careful and gentle, attuned to Penelope's comfort and never pushing beyond what she was ready for. The physical intimacy they shared was a revelation to Penelope, who had only known violation. Jacob showed her that touch could be loving, that passion could be tender, that she could feel safe even in her most vulnerable moments. Christmas came, and Jacob surprised Penelope by bringing home a small pine tree that he set up in the corner of the main room. "I know you probably had traditions back east," he said, looking almost shy. "I thought we could start some of our own." They decorated the tree with strings of dried berries and small ornaments Penelope fashioned from scraps of fabric. On Christmas morning, Jacob presented her with a rocking chair he had been secretly building in the barn, perfectly sized for nursing a baby. Penelope gave him a new shirt she had sewn from the fabric they had bought in Yuma, embroidered with his initials. "This is the best Christmas I have ever had," Penelope said, settled in her new rocking chair with Jacob sitting nearby. "The first of many," Jacob promised. As winter deepened and Penelope's pregnancy progressed, the ranch became a cocoon of domestic happiness. Jacob doted on her shamelessly, bringing her small gifts and treats from town, building up the fire before she woke so she would not be cold, reading to her when she was too tired to read aloud herself. The two ranch hands, Pete and Samuel, who had kept their distance early on per Jacob's orders, began to warm to Penelope as they saw how happy their boss was. They tipped their hats respectfully when they saw her and occasionally brought gifts of their own, a rabbit for stew or some fresh eggs from their own small chicken coop. In February, when the winter storms made travel difficult, Penelope's time came. Jacob rode through dangerous conditions to fetch Mrs. Martinez, an experienced midwife from a nearby Mexican settlement. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and Jacob refused to leave Penelope's side despite Mrs. Martinez's suggestions that he wait elsewhere. He held Penelope's hand and let her squeeze until his fingers went numb. He wiped her face with cool cloths and murmured encouragement in her ear. When the pain became almost unbearable, he let her curse at him, took her anger and fear without flinching, and continued to be her anchor through the storm. Finally, in the early hours of a February morning, a baby's cry filled the small bedroom. Mrs. Martinez worked efficiently, and moments later she placed a squirming, red-faced infant in Penelope's arms. "A boy," she announced with a tired smile. "A healthy baby boy." Penelope looked down at the tiny face, and her heart felt too big for her chest. The baby had dark hair and was screaming lustily, his small fists waving. She had been afraid throughout the pregnancy that she might not be able to love this child, this reminder of trauma. But the moment she held him, all those fears evaporated. He was hers. He was innocent and perfect, and she loved him with a fierceness that took her breath away. She looked up at Jacob, who was staring at the baby with an expression of awe. "Do you want to hold him?" Jacob nodded, unable to speak. Penelope placed the baby carefully in his large arms, and she watched as this strong, stoic man became utterly undone by the weight of a 6-pound infant. Tears tracked down Jacob's face as he cradled the baby against his chest. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your papa, and I promise I will keep you safe. You and your mama both, always." Penelope felt her own tears flow freely. "What should we name him?" Jacob looked at her, his eyes shining. "What do you think of Thomas? After the preacher who married us." "Thomas Xavier," Penelope said, testing the name. "I like it. Tommy for short." Jacob smiled, and Penelope thought she had never seen anything more beautiful than this man holding their son, for he was their son now in every way that mattered, with such tender care. The weeks following Tommy's birth were exhausting but joyful. Jacob proved to be a natural father, rising in the night to change the baby and bring him to Penelope to nurse, then staying awake with her to talk quietly while Tommy fed. He built a cradle that rocked smoothly and installed it next to their bed, for Penelope had moved into Jacob's room during her pregnancy, her own room converted into the nursery they had planned. Spring arrived with a profusion of wildflowers, and Jacob took Penelope and Tommy on picnics to that field he had mentioned so long ago. They would spread a blanket and lie in the sun while Tommy napped between them, and Penelope would think about how far she had come from that terrified woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 9 months earlier. "You ever regret it?" she asked Jacob one afternoon as they watched clouds drift across the brilliant blue sky. "Taking on a mail-order bride, getting more than you bargained for." Jacob rolled onto his side and propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her. Every day I wake up grateful that you answered my advertisement. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Penelope. You and Tommy both. Even though Tommy is not yours by blood, he is mine in every way that matters." Jacob reached over to touch the sleeping baby's soft cheek. "Blood does not make a father. Love does. Choice does. I choose to be his father every single day." Penelope pulled Jacob down for a kiss, deep and full of love. When they broke apart, she whispered against his lips, "I want more children, with you. Your children by blood as well as by choice." Jacob's eyes darkened with emotion and desire. "I want that too. A whole houseful if you are willing." As summer approached, bringing with it the scorching heat of the Arizona desert, the ranch prospered. The cattle herd had grown, and Jacob was able to hire 2 additional hands to help with the work. He began to spend more time at the house, unwilling to be away from Penelope and Tommy for long stretches. In July, they made the trip to Yuma together as a family, Tommy now 5 months old and fat and happy. The townspeople greeted them warmly, and Penelope noticed the looks of approval and happiness directed at Jacob. Apparently, his transformation from solitary, stern rancher to devoted husband and father had not gone unnoticed. At the general store, Samuel greeted them enthusiastically. "Look at that fine boy. He has grown so much. And Mrs. Xavier, you are positively glowing." Penelope blushed, but Jacob beamed with pride. While Jacob conducted his business, Penelope browsed the store with Tommy on her hip. She was looking at some new fabric when a rough-looking man entered, clearly drunk despite the early hour. "Well, well," the man slurred, looking Penelope up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "Aren't you a pretty little thing? Xavier sure landed himself a beauty." Penelope stepped back, her arms tightening around Tommy. "Excuse me," she said firmly, trying to move past him. The man blocked her path, reaching out to grab her arm. "Don't be unfriendly now. I just want to—" He did not get to finish the sentence. Jacob appeared seemingly out of nowhere, his hand clamping down on the man's wrist with enough force to make the drunk yelp in pain. "You will take your hand off my wife," Jacob said, his voice deadly calm but edged with barely controlled fury. "You will apologize to her, and then you will leave this store and stay away from my family. Do you understand?" The man, suddenly much more sober, nodded frantically. "I am sorry, Mrs. Xavier. I meant no disrespect." Jacob released him with a slight shove, and the man practically ran from the store. Jacob immediately turned to Penelope, his expression shifting from dangerous to concerned. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" "I am fine," Penelope assured him, though her heart was racing. "You appeared very quickly. I was watching. I always watch when we are in town." Jacob's jaw was still tight with anger. "I will not let anyone make you feel unsafe, not ever again." Penelope reached up with her free hand to cup his cheek. "I know. That is why I love you." The tension drained from Jacob's face, and he leaned down to kiss her forehead, then Tommy's. "Let us finish our business and go home." That autumn, Penelope realized she was pregnant again, this time with a child that was Jacob's in every sense. The joy on his face when she told him was worth every moment of morning sickness to come. This pregnancy was different from the first, not shadowed by trauma but celebrated with pure happiness. Jacob became even more protective and attentive if such a thing was possible. He insisted on hiring a woman from town, Mrs. Chen, to come help with the housework so Penelope could rest more. Mrs. Chen was a widow whose children had grown and moved away, and she was grateful for the work and the company. She doted on Tommy and fussed over Penelope like a mother hen. Tommy celebrated his first birthday in February with a small party that included the ranch hands, Mrs. Chen, and a few neighbors from surrounding ranches. He smashed his face into a cake Penelope had made and laughed with delight. and Jacob lifted him high in the air, making him squeal with joy. "You are a wonderful father," Penelope said that night as they lay in bed, her head on Jacob's chest and his hand resting on her growing belly. "I had a good teacher in what not to do," Jacob replied quietly. "And I have you to show me what love should look like." In April, 2 years after Penelope had first arrived in Yuma, she gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Patricia Rose. The labor was easier this time, and Jacob was once again by her side through it all. When he held his daughter for the first time, his own flesh and blood, Penelope watched his face carefully for any difference in how he reacted compared to when he had first held Tommy. There was none. The love in his eyes was identical, absolute and unconditional. "She is perfect," Jacob said, tears streaming down his face. "Just like her mother. And her brother," Penelope added. "Do not forget Tommy." As if summoned by his name, the door opened and Mrs. Chen brought Tommy in, the toddler eager to meet his new sister. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed and arranged Tommy carefully next to Penelope so he could see the baby. "This is your sister Patricia," Penelope told him. "You are going to be the best big brother." Tommy reached out a chubby finger to touch Patricia's tiny hand, and when she gripped it reflexively, his face lit up with wonder. "Baby," he said clearly, one of his few words. "Yes, baby," Jacob confirmed, his arm around Tommy's small shoulders. "Our baby, our family." Penelope looked at the four of them, Tommy leaning against her side, Patricia in her arms, and Jacob surrounding them all with his strong, protective presence, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was everything she had never dared to hope for when she had boarded that stagecoach 2 years ago, running from a nightmare into an unknown future. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters when money was tight, summers when drought threatened the herd, occasional conflicts with neighboring ranchers over water and grazing rights. But through it all, Jacob and Penelope faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. Tommy grew into a bright, energetic boy who followed his father around the ranch whenever possible, learning to ride and rope and care for the animals. Patricia was quieter, more thoughtful, but with a stubborn streak that reminded Jacob of Penelope. She loved helping her mother in the garden and could often be found with her nose in a book. When Tommy was 5 and Patricia 3, Penelope gave birth to twin boys, James and Jonathan, who kept the entire household in chaos with their endless energy and mischief. Jacob built another addition onto the house, and the once lonely ranch became filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing. One evening, when the twins were about 2 years old, Penelope found Jacob sitting on the porch in the twilight, watching the older children play in the yard while the twins napped inside. She settled into the rocking chair next to him, the same one he had given her that first Christmas. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, taking his hand. Jacob squeezed her fingers gently. "I am thinking about how close I came to never having this. If I had been like my father, if I had not seen the fear in your eyes and decided to be different, none of this would exist. Our family, our happiness, all of it. But you are not like your father," Penelope said firmly. "You are the best man I know, Jacob Xavier. You are kind and patient and loving. Our children are lucky to have you as their father. I am the lucky one." Jacob brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "You gave me everything I never knew I wanted. A real home, a real family, real love." "We gave each other those things," Penelope corrected. "I was so afraid when I arrived, afraid of you, afraid of the future, afraid of everything. But you spent a year proving I did not need to be afraid. You showed me what real love looks like, what safety feels like, what it means to be cherished." Jacob pulled her from her chair onto his lap, and she went willingly, curling against him the way she had learned to do over the years. "I love you, Penelope Xavier, more than I could ever put into words." "I love you too," she whispered against his neck. "Thank you for being patient with me, for giving me time to heal, for loving Tommy as your own, for building this beautiful life with me." They sat together as the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and red. In the yard, Tommy was teaching Patricia how to throw a rope, their laughter carrying on the warm evening breeze. Inside, the twins would wake soon, demanding dinner and attention. Mrs. Chen was preparing a meal in the kitchen, humming to herself as she worked. It was a life of noise and chaos and endless work, but it was also a life filled with love and laughter and security. Penelope thought about that terrified girl who had stepped off the stagecoach, and she wanted to tell her that everything would be all right, that the stern, frightening cowboy waiting for her would become her best friend, her protector, her partner, and the love of her life. She wanted to tell her that the fear would fade, replaced by trust and affection, and eventually a love so deep and abiding that it colored every moment of every day. That the child she carried, conceived in violence, would grow into a wonderful boy who brought nothing but joy. That she would have more children, children born from love, and that all of them would be treasured equally. But mostly, she wanted to tell that frightened girl that she was stronger than she knew, that she would survive, that she would thrive, that she would find happiness in the most unexpected place with the most unexpected person. Tommy's voice broke through her thoughts. "Papa, Mama, come see. I made a loop." Jacob stood, lifting Penelope with him effortlessly before setting her on her feet. "Shall we go admire our son's cowboy skills?" he asked with a grin. "Absolutely," Penelope said, taking his hand as they walked down the porch steps together. They crossed the yard to where their children waited, eager to show off their accomplishments and vie for their parents' attention and praise. Jacob swung Patricia up onto his shoulders while Penelope examined Tommy's rope technique with exaggerated seriousness that made him beam with pride. This was their life now. This was their happily ever after. Not perfect, but real and beautiful and worth every moment of fear and pain it had taken to get here. Penelope looked at Jacob over Tommy's head, and he looked back at her, and the love that passed between them needed no words. Later that night, after the children were all bathed and tucked into bed, after the evening chores were done and the house was quiet, Jacob and Penelope lay in their bed, tangled together in the darkness. "You think we should have more children?" Jacob asked, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her arm. Penelope laughed softly. "We have 4 already. Is that not enough, I suppose? But I love being a father, and you are such a wonderful mother." "We can discuss it," Penelope said, snuggling closer. "But perhaps we can wait until the twins are a bit older and less destructive." Jacob chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "That is fair. Though I am not sure Jonathan will ever be less destructive. That boy could find trouble in an empty room." They fell into comfortable silence, and Penelope thought Jacob had drifted off to sleep until he spoke again, his voice quiet and serious. "I am proud of you, you know, of how far you have come. When you arrived, you could barely look at me without shaking. Now you are this strong, confident woman who runs this household and raises our children and is not afraid of anything." "I am still afraid sometimes," Penelope admitted. "But the fear is different now. It is not about you hurting me or controlling me. It is normal fear. Worry about the children getting sick or the ranch failing or something happening to you. The kind of fear that comes from having something precious to lose." "We will not lose each other," Jacob promised, pulling her closer. "We have built something too strong to crumble." This family, this love, it is ours forever." Penelope tilted her face up to kiss him, slow and deep and full of promise. "Forever," she agreed. As the years continued to pass, the Xavier Ranch became known throughout the territory as a prosperous, well-run operation. But more than that, it was known as a happy place. People spoke of how Jacob Xavier's face lit up whenever he mentioned his wife, how his children were polite and well-mannered, but also clearly loved and given room to be themselves. Tommy grew into a responsible young man who shared his father's talent with horses. Patricia developed a love of learning that led Jacob to hire a tutor to come to the ranch twice a week, and he spoke proudly of his daughter's intelligence to anyone who would listen. The twins, while still mischievous, channeled their energy into helping around the ranch, competing to see who could complete chores faster or better. Eventually, Penelope and Jacob did have one more child, a daughter named Mary, born when Penelope was 30 and Jacob 38. She was a surprise, arriving 6 years after the twins, but a welcome one. By then, Patricia was old enough to help care for her baby sister, and Tommy and the twins doted on her shamelessly. By the time their 20th wedding anniversary approached, the oldest children were grown or nearly so. Tommy, at 19, was running much of the day-to-day ranch operations alongside his father. Patricia, at 17, had received an offer to attend a teaching college in California, something she was seriously considering. The twins, now 15, were inseparable and already talking about expanding the ranch into new ventures. Only Mary, at 6, was still young enough to need constant supervision and care, and she had the entire family wrapped around her little finger. On their anniversary, Jacob surprised Penelope with a trip to Yuma, just the two of them. Mrs. Chen and Patricia promised to manage the household and children for 2 days while they were gone. 2 whole days alone, Penelope said as they rode the wagon into town, the same route they had traveled so many times over the years. "I am not sure I remember how to function without children underfoot." Jacob laughed. "We will figure it out together." They stayed at the small hotel in Yuma, a luxury they rarely indulged in. That evening they had dinner at the town's nicest restaurant, such as it was, and then walked along the banks of the Colorado River as the sun set. 20 years, Jacob said, his arm around Penelope's waist. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like we just met yesterday." "I was so afraid of you," Penelope said, looking up at the man who had become her entire world. "You looked so stern and serious, and I was convinced you were going to be a tyrant. And instead, you got a man who lets his children use him as a jungle gym and cannot say no when his wife wants to adopt every stray animal that wanders onto the property." Penelope laughed, because it was true. Their ranch now included not just cattle and horses, but also a collection of dogs, cats, chickens, and even a goat that Patricia had rescued and refused to part with. "You are exactly what I needed, even though I did not know it at the time," Penelope said seriously. "You saved me, Jacob. From my stepfather, from a life of fear, from believing I was not worthy of love." "You saved me too," Jacob replied. "From loneliness, from becoming bitter and closed off like my father, from a life without joy or purpose. You and the children gave me everything." They stood there by the river, holding each other as the last light faded from the sky, and Penelope thought about all the moments that had led them to this one. The fear and pain of the beginning, the slow building of trust, the gradual transformation of strangers into partners and then into lovers, the family they had created together. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had not sent for a mail-order bride?" Penelope asked. Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes, but I cannot imagine it with any real clarity. You and the children are so woven into every part of who I am that trying to imagine life without you is like trying to imagine life without breathing. Technically possible, I suppose, but not really living. Back at the hotel, they made love with the leisurely passion of long married couples who knew each other's bodies as well as their own. Afterward, they lay tangled together, talking late into the night about their children, their dreams for the future, the possibility of grandchildren someday. Tommy has been spending a lot of time at the Johnson Ranch lately, Jacob mentioned with a knowing smile. I suspect he is interested in their daughter Sarah. She is a sweet girl, Penelope said. I would be happy to have her as a daughter-in-law someday. And Patricia wants to go to that teaching college. Are you all right with that? It is so far away. Penelope sighed. It is hard to think about her leaving. But she has such a good mind, Jacob. It would be a shame to waste it. We will miss her terribly, but we have to let her follow her dreams. When did our children get so grown up? Jacob asked, sounding slightly bewildered. They have been growing up all along, Penelope said gently. We just did not notice because we were busy raising them, but we did a good job. They are good people, all of them, kind and responsible and happy. Because they had a wonderful mother, Jacob said, kissing her forehead. And a wonderful father who showed them what a good man looks like. They returned to the ranch the next day to find controlled chaos. Mary had convinced the twins to help her build a fort in the main room using every blanket in the house, and Patricia was trying to restore order while also preparing dinner. Tommy was late returning from the Johnson Ranch, and Mrs. Chen had thrown up her hands and declared the Xavier children were impossible. But everyone was happy and healthy, and as the family gathered for dinner that evening, the noise and laughter filling the house, Penelope looked around the table at the faces she loved most in the world and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. This was her life. These were her people. This big, noisy, chaotic, loving family that had grown from the ashes of fear and trauma into something beautiful and strong and unshakable. After dinner, as was their tradition, the family gathered in the main room. Patricia played the piano Jacob had bought her for her 15th birthday while everyone sang. Mary fell asleep on Jacob's lap, and he rocked her gently while humming along. Tommy and the twins argued good-naturedly about something that had happened during their work that day. Penelope sat in her rocking chair, now worn smooth by 20 years of use, and watched it all with a peaceful smile. When Jacob caught her eye over Mary's sleeping head, he smiled too, that special smile he reserved just for her. Later, much later, after all the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Jacob found Penelope on the porch, looking up at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Everything. Nothing. How lucky I am, how far we have come." Penelope leaned back against his solid warmth. "Do you remember the night of that big storm, early in our marriage when you told me about your mother?" "I remember. That was the night I started to believe you might be different, that maybe I could trust you." Penelope turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you for being patient with me, for giving me the time I needed to heal, for loving me even when I could not love you back yet." "Loving you was never difficult," Jacob said simply. "Waiting for you to feel safe enough to love me back was the hardest thing I have ever done, but it was worth every moment. You were worth every moment." They stood there together under the vast Arizona sky, holding each other the way they had learned to do over the years, with complete trust and total love. The ranch was quiet around them, the land they had built their life on peaceful in the darkness. Inside the house, their children slept safely in their beds, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. Tommy dreamed of the pretty Johnson girl and the life he might build with her someday. Patricia dreamed of teaching and learning and all the possibilities that lay ahead. The twins dreamed their twin dreams, separate but intertwined. And Mary dreamed whatever innocent dreams 6-year-olds dream, untroubled by the fears that had once haunted her mother. This was the life Penelope had never dared to hope for. This was the love she had been convinced she did not deserve. This was the family that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings, from a marriage that started with fear and distance and became something extraordinary. Jacob had spent a year proving she did not need to be afraid, and then he had spent 19 more years proving that love could be constant and true, that safety could be real, that happiness could last. And as they stood there under the stars, Penelope knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together, the way they had faced everything else. As partners, as lovers, as best friends, as the parents of the family they had built from nothing. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Yuma, Arizona territory, terrified and alone, was gone. In her place stood Penelope Xavier, wife and mother, loved and cherished, strong and confident, surrounded by a family that adored her and a man who would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had reason to be afraid again. Their story, which had begun with fear and uncertainty, had become a testament to the transformative power of patience, kindness, and love. It was proof that broken things could be mended, that wounds could heal, that the darkest beginnings could lead to the brightest futures. And as Jacob led Penelope back into their home, into the life they had built together over 20 years of marriage, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The fear was gone. In its place was love, pure and simple and everlasting, and they lived happily ever after just as they deserved.